Why is this happening to me? I can't take it anymore. Please, make it stop.
The fluorescent lights of Murphy's corner store buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the near-empty shelves. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the store would close in 13 minutes. Margaret stood in the bread aisle, her weathered fingers wrapped around a single loaf of wheat bread, the only loaf left. She'd walked 4 blocks in the rain to get here, and this bread, this one item, represented the next 3 days of meals. Toast for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch if she was careful, maybe soup with the heels if she had any broth left at home. She was turning toward the register when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the fluorescent-lit silence of an almost-closed grocery store. Sobbing. Quiet, muffled, but unmistakable. Coming from the next aisle over. Margaret's first instinct was to keep walking. She was 72 years old. She'd learned long ago that the world was full of sadness, and you couldn't fix all of it. Especially not when you had $3.47 in your purse and that had to last until Friday. But her feet stopped moving. The crying continued, broken, desperate, the kind that came from someone who'd been holding it in too long. Margaret looked down at the bread in her hands. She looked toward the register, where the teenage cashier was scrolling through his phone, oblivious. She looked at the clock. Then she set the bread down on top of a shelf of discount pasta and walked toward the sound. Before we reveal who this stranger really was, ask yourself, would you have done the same? Would you have given away your only meal to someone you'd never met? Hit the subscribe button, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about sacrifice. Trust me, you need to see this. The man was sitting on the floor. That was the first thing that struck her as wrong. People didn't sit on grocery store floors. They stood. They browsed. They moved through the aisles with purpose or boredom, but they didn't collapse onto the scuffed linoleum like their legs had given out. He was younger than she'd expected from the sound of his crying, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark slacks that had seen better days. His face was buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping quiet. Around him, scattered across the floor, were at least a dozen items he'd apparently been trying to juggle. Crackers, peanut butter, canned soup, apples that had rolled toward the opposite shelf. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly. The man's head snapped up. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild with embarrassment. He scrambled to stand, nearly slipping on one of the apples. "I'm sorry. I was just..." He grabbed at the items frantically, trying to gather them all at once, but his hands were shaking too badly. A can of soup slipped from his grasp and rolled away. "It's all right," Margaret said. "Here, let me help." She bent down her knees, protesting after the long walk, and picked up the soup can. Then the crackers. The peanut butter. The man stared at her like she'd appeared out of thin air, like kindness was a language he'd forgotten existed. "I don't have a basket," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I thought I could just carry it all, but I can't. I can't even..." He stopped himself, pressing his palms against his eyes. Margaret handed him the items she'd collected, and he clutched them against his chest like they might disappear. "The baskets are by the door," she said gently. "I know." He swallowed hard. "I know where they are. I didn't want to take one because I wasn't sure if I could." He stopped again. Looked away. "I wasn't sure which items I could afford." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret understood immediately. She'd been there. 30 years ago, after Paul died and the medical bills came, and the pension turned out to be barely enough to cover rent. She remembered standing in grocery stores doing mental math, putting items back, choosing between protein and produce, between eating and dignity. "How much do you have?" she asked quietly. The man's face flushed with shame. "I shouldn't have. This is ridiculous. I'm a grown man, sitting on the floor of a grocery store. I should just..." "How much do you have?" Margaret repeated, firmer this time. He closed his eyes. $12.30. She looked at the items in his arms. Even with the cheapest versions, it was probably close to 20. "When did you last eat?" she asked. The man's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Sunday." It was Tuesday night. Margaret had learned something important over her 72 years. When someone was drowning, they didn't need questions. They needed a hand. "Come with me," she said. The man blinked. "What? You're going to put those items back except for the peanut butter and the bread, the store brand, not that one. Then you're going to follow me." "I don't understand. Do you trust me?" I had Nuth Kleiling with Vigu. It was an absurd question. They were strangers. He had no reason to trust her. But something in his expression shifted a desperate, exhausted surrender. "Yes," he whispered. 10 minutes later, they stood outside the store under the flickering overhang light. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily on the metal roof above them. Margaret held the plastic bag containing her loaf of bread. The man stood beside her, empty-handed, looking more lost than before. She held the bag out to him. "Take this." He stared at the bread like she'd offered him a brick of gold. "I can't." "Yes, you can. Ma'am, you paid for that. That's yours. I can't just—" "You haven't eaten since Sunday," Margaret said simply. "I ate dinner 3 hours ago. I have oatmeal at home for breakfast. You need this more than I do." The man's eyes were filling with tears again. "I can't take food from you." "You're not taking it. I'm giving it. You don't even know me." Margaret smiled a small, sad smile that held decades of hard-earned wisdom. "I know enough." The man's hands trembled as he reached for the bag. His fingers brushed against hers, and she felt how cold they were. "I'll pay you back," he said hoarsely. "I swear to God, I'll pay you back. As soon as things turn around, I'll find you and—" "I don't want you to pay me back." "Then what do you want?" Margaret looked at him, at the expensive watch on his wrist that he probably couldn't bear to pawn yet, at the dress shirt that spoke of a different life, at the eyes that were trying so hard to hold onto something that was slipping away. "I want you to remember this moment," she said quietly, "and when you're back on your feet, and you will be, I want you to do the same for someone else." The man's name was David, though Margaret wouldn't learn this until much later. What she didn't know as she walked away into the rain was that David had been, until 6 weeks ago, a managing director at a private equity firm in the city. She didn't know that he'd lost his job in a scandal that wasn't his fault, a partner's embezzlement scheme that torpedoed the entire company. She didn't know that his wife had left him 3 days after he was fired, taking their daughter and half their savings. She didn't know that the expensive watch was the last thing he owned that was worth anything, and he wore it because taking it off felt like admitting defeat. She didn't know that he'd been sleeping in his car for a week. She didn't know that he'd come to the grocery store with the last of his cash, trying to buy enough food to last until his unemployment check cleared, and the shame of not being able to afford even that had broken something fundamental inside him. She didn't know that he'd been sitting on that floor seriously considering whether his daughter would be better off if he just disappeared entirely. She didn't know any of this. But somehow, she'd known exactly what he needed. The man crying on the floor used to be rich. If you're thinking this story just got interesting, you have no idea what's coming. Smash that subscribe button because the next part will reveal something about Margaret that makes this moment even more powerful. Don't miss it. Margaret walked the 4 blocks home in the rain, her thin jacket soaked through by the time she reached her apartment building. The elevator was broken again. It was broken more often than not, so she took the stairs to the 3rd floor, her knees aching with each step. Inside her apartment, she stood in the small kitchen and looked at the cabinet. Half a container of oatmeal, some tea bags, a can of soup she'd been saving. It would be enough. It had to be enough. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in her worn armchair by the window, looking out at the rain-slicked street below. Somewhere out there, a stranger was eating bread that should have been hers. And somehow, despite the gnawing hunger that would wake her early tomorrow morning, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. 6 months later, Margaret was walking back from the library when she saw the police cars. 2 of them, parked outside her apartment building with their lights off. Not an emergency, something else? Her heart jumped. Had something happened to one of the neighbors? Mama Ada on the 4th floor was 90 and lived alone. Or maybe it was... "Excuse me, ma'am?" Margaret turned. A police officer was approaching her, a woman with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. "Are you Margaret?" The fear was immediate and chemical. Yes. What's wrong? What happened? Nothing's wrong, ma'am. Someone's been trying to find you. Could you come with me? The black Mercedes was parked half a block down, far enough from the police cars that Margaret hadn't noticed it initially. As she approached, the back door opened. David stepped out. But it wasn't the David she'd met in the grocery store. This David wore a crisp navy suit and a coat that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His hair was cut. His face was shaved. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. More than that, he looked alive. "Mrs." he said, and his voice broke on her name. Margaret stopped walking, her mind struggling to connect the broken man on the grocery store floor with the person standing in front of her. "I don't understand," she said. "How did you—" "I've been looking for you for 3 days," David said. "I went back to the store. The cashier didn't remember you. I talked to everyone in the neighborhood. I filed a report with the police, not a criminal report, a search request. I told them I needed to find the woman who saved my life. I didn't save your life. I gave you a loaf of bread. You gave me more than bread." David took a step closer, and Margaret could see that his eyes were wet. "That night," he said quietly, "I was going to drive my car into the river. I'd already picked the spot. I was going to do it after the store closed. But then you saw me. You didn't walk past. You didn't pretend I was invisible. You looked at me like I was still human." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "And then you gave me your food. Not your extra food. Not food you didn't need. You gave me the only food you had. I could see it in your eyes you needed that bread. And you gave it to me anyway. Anyone would have." "No." David's voice was firm now. "They wouldn't have. I've spent 3 months rebuilding my life. I've called in every favor, reconnected with every contact, fought my way back from absolute zero. And do you know what I kept thinking about? That moment. That choice you made. The way you looked at me and decided I was worth your sacrifice." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I told you I'd pay you back." Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a check. Her eyes widened. $50,000. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "Yes, you can. This is too much. The bread cost $3. "The bread cost you days of meals," David said gently. "It cost you hunger and sacrifice and the kind of selflessness most people only claim to have. This—" he gestured to the check. "This is nothing compared to what you gave me, and it's only the beginning. You think that's the twist? Oh, we're just getting started." If this moment gave you chills, subscribe right now, because what Margaret says next about her own past will completely reframe everything you just watched. The real story is about to begin. Margaret tried to speak and couldn't. The check trembled in her hands. David moved closer. "I made some calls about you. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to understand who you were. I found out you worked as a nurse for 43 years. I found out you never remarried after your husband died. I found out you've been living on a pension that barely covers rent. I found out you volunteer twice a week at a food bank even though you're food insecure yourself." Tears were sliding down Margaret's face now. "I found out," David continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that you're one of the best people I've ever heard of. And I've decided something. I've spent my entire career helping rich people get richer. I've made millions doing it, but I'm done with that now. I'm starting something different, a foundation that helps people who've fallen through the cracks, people like I was 6 months ago, and I want you to help me run it." Margaret's breath caught. "What?" "I'm serious. A salary, full benefits, health insurance, real health insurance, not Medicare, a place on the board. I want your wisdom. I want your heart. I want to build something that matters, and I can't think of anyone better to help me do it." "I'm 72 years old," Margaret said weakly. "I'm not—" "You're exactly who we need." The rain had started again, light and persistent. David pulled an umbrella from the car and held it over both of them. "There's one more thing," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said, about paying it forward, about remembering the moment and doing the same for someone else. And I realized something you've been doing that your whole life, haven't you?" Margaret couldn't answer. Her throat was too tight. So, here's what I want to know, David said softly. Who did it for you? Who was the person who taught you that kindness isn't transactional? That love isn't something you give only when you have extra? For a long time, Margaret just stood there under the umbrella, watching the rain fall on the empty street. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Ruth. She was my neighbor when I was 9 years old. We just moved to this country, my parents, my brother, and me. We didn't speak English. We didn't know anyone. My father was trying to find work, but nobody would hire him. We had nothing, not even food. She closed her eyes, remembering. One night, Ruth knocked on our door. She was an old woman, probably about as old as I am now. She barely had anything herself, but she brought us a pot of soup and bread, and she kept coming back every few days with something, a bag of rice, some vegetables, once, a chicken. She never made it feel like charity. She never made us feel small. She just gave. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at David. When I was 12, Ruth died. I remember my mother crying at the funeral. I asked her why she was so sad when Ruth wasn't even family. And my mother said, "Some people teach you that the world is good. Those people are the only family that matters." The words hung in the rain-washed air. Ruth taught me that kindness isn't about having extra, Margaret said. It's about seeing someone who needs more than you do and deciding that their need matters more than your comfort. She taught me that you don't have to be rich to be generous. You just have to be willing to notice. David nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. So this, he gestured to the check, the car, everything. This isn't really about paying you back. No, Margaret said softly. It's about continuing something that started a long time ago. Now you understand where it all started. But here's the question that should haunt you. How many chains of kindness died because someone chose to walk past? Subscribe, because you're about to see the ripple effect of that one loaf of bread, and it's bigger than you can possibly imagine. The foundation launched 4 months later. They called it the Ruth Project. Margaret did join the board. She worked 3 days a week, helping identify people and families who needed help, not the people who qualified for existing programs, but the ones who fell just outside the lines. The single mother who made $3 too much to get food stamps. The man whose unemployment ran out before he found work. The elderly couple whose medical bills bankrupted them. The people the system forgot. Within a year, they'd helped 400 families. Within 2 years, they'd opened 3 more offices in different cities. David proved to be exactly what Margaret hoped, someone who'd been broken and rebuilt and understood that wealth meant nothing if you kept it all for yourself. But the moment that mattered most happened 3 years after that night in the grocery store. Margaret was in the foundation office when she got a call from a program director in the city. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you," the director said. "She says you changed her life, but she doesn't think you'll remember her." Margaret frowned. "Put her on." There was a pause, some shuffling, and then a young woman's voice came through the line. This is going to sound crazy, but do you remember giving a girl money for bus fare about 6 years ago? Outside a pharmacy in Queens?" Margaret's mind spun back. 6 years ago, a pharmacy, a teenage girl with a black eye and a desperate expression asking for money to get to her grandmother's house across the city. "I remember," Margaret said slowly. "You gave me $40, the woman said. You asked if I was safe. I lied and said I was. But I wasn't. And that money, I didn't use it for bus fare. I used it for a motel room. Just for one night so I could figure out what to do. So I didn't have to go home to." She trailed off, but Margaret understood. "The next day, I went to a shelter. They helped me get into foster care. I finished high school. I got into college. And now I'm graduating with a degree in social work, and I wanted to work with the foundation because I saw what you're doing and I wanted to say thank you. You didn't save my life that night, but you gave me the space to save myself." Margaret had to set the phone down because her hands were shaking. She didn't remember the girl's name from that night. She'd given money to dozens of people over the years, a few dollars here, a few dollars there, whenever she had it and saw someone who needed it more. She'd never known if any of it mattered. Now she knew. That evening, Margaret sat in her new apartment, the one the foundation's health insurance and salary had allowed her to move into, with an elevator that worked and windows that didn't leak, and thought about chains. Not the kind that bind. The kind that connect. Ruth to Margaret. Margaret to David. David to 400 families. Margaret to a teenage girl with a black eye. That girl to whoever she'd help in her career. Each link in the chain invisible until you stepped back far enough to see the pattern. Each act of kindness a stone dropped in water, rippling outward in ways you'd never see. Margaret turned 81 on a Tuesday. She woke in her comfortable apartment, the one with the working elevator and windows that didn't leak, and found 73 birthday cards waiting for her at the foundation office. 73 cards from 73 families whose lives had been touched by the Ruth Project. But it was the 74th card that made her cry. It came by courier at noon, delivered in a simple white envelope with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing crayon on construction paper of a woman handing bread to a man. Below it, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for giving my daddy food when he was sad. Now he's happy and I have a home. Love, Emma." David's daughter. Margaret held that drawing for a long time, tracing the bright yellow sun the child had drawn in the corner, the smiling stick figures, the loaf of bread colored in careful brown strokes. This, she thought, this is what matters. Not the foundation's expansion into 12 cities. Not the 17,000 families they'd helped. Not even the awards or recognition. This, a child who had a father because a stranger decided kindness mattered more than hunger. That evening, the foundation threw Margaret a small party. Just the staff, a few board members, David and his daughter Emma, and Sarah, the former teenage girl who was now director of operations. As they gathered around a cake with entirely too many candles, David stood to speak. "I'm not going to give a long speech," he said, grinning at Margaret, "because Margaret taught me that real love is shown, not spoken. But I do want to say one thing." He looked around the room at the faces gathered there, people of different ages, backgrounds, stories, united by a single thread of connection that traced back to one woman's choice. 10 years ago, Margaret gave me a loaf of bread, but what she really gave me was a blueprint for being human. She showed me that our value isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we're willing to give away. That the truest wealth is found in the moment we decide someone else's need is more important than our own comfort. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. He bent down and she whispered something in his ear. David smiled, his eyes bright. "Emma wants to know if she can say something." Margaret nodded, her throat already tight. The little girl stepped forward, suddenly shy in front of all the adults. But then she looked at Margaret and her courage returned. "My daddy says you're the reason I get to know him," Emma said in her clear, small voice, "and I just wanted to say thank you, because he's the best daddy in the whole world." The room was very quiet. "And when I grow up," Emma continued, "I want to be like you. I want to help people who are sad. Because my teacher says that's what heroes do, and my daddy says you're a hero." Margaret knelt down, her knees protesting, but her heart soaring, and pulled the little girl into a hug. "You want to know a secret?" Margaret whispered. Emma nodded against her shoulder. "You don't have to wait until you grow up. You can start being kind right now. Today, every day. It doesn't take money or power or anything special. It just takes noticing when someone needs help and deciding to care." Emma pulled back, her eyes wide and serious. "I can do that. I know you can." Later that night, Margaret stood at her apartment window, looking out at the city lights scattered across the darkness like earthbound stars. She thought about Ruth, the elderly neighbor who taught her that kindness transcends language and circumstance. She thought about David, broken on a grocery store floor, now whole and purposeful. She thought about Sarah, once a terrified teenager, now helping others find safety. She thought about Emma, a child learning that heroism isn't about capes and powers, it's about choosing compassion when indifference would be easier. And she thought about all the people she'd never meet, connected to her through invisible threads of kindness that stretched forward into a future she wouldn't live to see. The chain would continue long after she was gone. That was the beauty of it. Kindness didn't die with the person who started it. It multiplied, it spread. It became woven into the fabric of other people's lives, influencing their choices, shaping their values, changing the trajectory of their compassion. Margaret pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window. She was 81 years old. She'd been poor most of her life. She'd known hunger, loss, loneliness, and struggle. But she'd also known something that many people with far more material wealth would never experience. The deep, bone-certain knowledge that her life had mattered. Not because of what she'd accumulated or achieved, but because of what she'd given away. The next morning, Margaret went to the foundation office and found a young man in the waiting room. He was 23, maybe 24, wearing clothes that had been slept in. His eyes had that hollow look. Margaret recognized immediately the look of someone who'd been fighting too long and was running out of strength. Sarah was at a meeting. The other staff members were busy with calls. Margaret sat down next to the young man. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Marcus," he said quietly. I don't know if I'm in the right place. I saw something online about help with rent assistance, but I don't know if I qualify. I don't know if anyone can." His voice broke. He looked away, ashamed. Margaret reached into her purse. She pulled out a $20 bill, part of the money she'd planned to use for groceries this week, and pressed it into his hand. "This isn't much," she said, "but I want you to take it and get yourself a hot meal. Then come back this afternoon. We'll figure out the rest together. Okay?" Marcus stared at the money like it was a lifeline. "I can't take this from you." "Yes, you can," Margaret said, smiling. "Someone did the same for me once. And now I'm doing it for you. And someday, when you're back on your feet, you'll do it for someone else." She stood up slowly, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. "You're going to be okay, Marcus. I promise. But first, go eat." He nodded, tears streaming down his face, and stumbled toward the door. Margaret watched him go, then turned back to her desk. There were 47 families on this week's assistance list. 47 lives that could be changed by simple acts of compassion. 47 opportunities to prove that in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, humanity still existed. That goodness still mattered. That we were all, in the end, just trying to help each other make it through the darkness and into the light. Margaret sat down at her desk, pulled out the first file, and got to work. Outside the window, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting light on a world that was still broken, still struggling, still searching, but also still capable of extraordinary kindness. Still full of people willing to give their last loaf of bread to a stranger. Still, against all odds and evidence to the contrary, fundamentally good. And as long as that remained true, as long as people chose compassion over indifference, connection over isolation, giving over taking, there was hope. Not the cheap, easy hope of wishful thinking, but the hard-earned, battle-tested hope that came from witnessing, again and again, the breathtaking power of one human being deciding that another human being mattered. That was the real miracle. Not that kindness existed, but that it endured. That it multiplied, that it refused, despite everything, to be extinguished. Margaret smiled to herself and opened the first file. There was work to do. There were always people who needed help, and she had learned long ago that the greatest privilege of being human was having the chance, every single day, to prove that love was stronger than fear. That connection was more powerful than isolation. That we were all, in the end, walking each other home. And that the journey was made bearable, even beautiful, by those willing to share their bread along the way. Now, it's your turn. When was the last time you gave something you actually needed, not just what was extra? If someone looked at your last 7 days, would they see kindness or convenience? What if the stranger you ignored today was one decision away from giving up? How many lives could change if you treated your last like it was meant for someone else? What would the world look like if we all remembered? We're not just living our own story, we're a chapter in someone else's. Don't just watch this story. Be this story. The world is waiting for your kindness. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to remember that goodness still exists. Drop a comment telling us about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness. Let's build a chain of hope together.